Welcome back to Normal Islands Live. It's actually nearly been 3 weeks since we did our last 1 hour show. My name is Curtis Daly. I will be your host this evening. And who better than the great Helena, aka No Justice MTG, to join us for the return. Helena, I hope you're well. I mean, you've been busy.
I've been super busy.
You're a highly sought out person.
True. I'm they're clearly the new faces in UK online politics, continually sought after, as you say, clearly. But actually, I'm mostly still tired after doing however much election coverage, which still feels like it was yesterday.
It does, actually. You're right. I mean, we covered you did a 15-hour stream. I know you were aiming for 24 hours and then OBS cut out on you. Which I'm very, very sorry about. We did a 12-hour live, and that was like 3 weeks ago, but I still feel emotionally drained from it.
I've still not fixed my sleeping pattern.
Oh, have you not?
No, I'm still waking up at like midday. It's terrible.
The stories tonight. Leeds riots have been weaponized by racists. Just Stop Oil activists get a combined sentence of 21 years. The government has confirmed they will restore funding to UNRWA, and the ICJ has ruled that Israel's occupation of Palestine is illegal. But let's go to our first story. Last night, chaos ensued where a riot broke out in Hare Hills, Leeds. But before anyone even knew the reasoning behind it, there were prominent people spinning a narrative to suit their, let's be honest, Islamophobic and racist agendas. We've had right-wing politicians, we've had GB News pundits claiming it's Muslims, it's failure of multiculturalism. Ollie London, controversial rent-a-gob, said this: hundreds of Muslims riot in Hare Hills, Leeds smashing police vehicles and attacking officers. Meanwhile, this is the town's newly elected local councillor. Is anyone surprised? Now, the person Ollie was referring to is Mothin Ali. He is the local Green councillor. Now, Ollie suggests quite strongly that Ollie was one of the perpetrators, when in fact he was there trying to calm the situation, physically standing up to people who were trying to increase tensions, pulling objects off people who were literally fanning the flames on a big fire that erupted. And we have a video of him here.
Look, he's the only one stopping it.
Brother, leave it.
Leave him alone.
This is our neighbourhood. This is our neighbourhood. Well, it's going to get worse than it. Well, don't burn it then. Who wanted it? Who wanted it? Fire, don't explode. Don't burn it. Who's inside that house? You're going to be blamed for their deaths. Think before you act. There's children in there. There's families in there. Think before you act. This is our neighbourhood. That's right. Those cameras are recording each and every one of us. You have to be at your houses. We've got uncles who did this 10 years ago, and they got their whole lives destroyed for doing one little silly thing. Use your brains. Don't get excited. You've got to live here. This is your community. And you can't treat it like this. You're right. Yes, brother. You can't treat it. That's enough. The house is there now. That's enough.
Now, many people have been smearing Mothin Ali, using his face as a Muslim to try and whip up Islamophobia, but he was the hero of the night. Does that stop the right-wing lies? Of course not. Far-right activist Tommy Robinson joined in on the smears, and he said this: let me introduce to the newly elected councillor for the area rioting tonight in Leeds. Multiple reports is even on the streets with them. Alex Phillips, right-wing commentator, claiming, right, this is a race riot. What is happening in Leeds is a race riot. Simple. Now, look, none of us are surprised at the Islamophobia, but Phillips's comments is a new realm of shocking, right? Claiming that it's a race riot, essentially that brown and black people are starting a war on white people. This is a vile thing to say, and of course, it's not true. But what is the truth? Well, Novara Media are one of the few outlets who are doing really truthful reporting on the ground, as North of England Novara editor Craig Gent was actually there. This is what he said. It is understood children were being taken into care by agency workers. Police attended the scene and people appeared to first throw things at a police car before flipping on its side. Now, elsewhere in the article, Gent reports that residents of all races and faiths came together to try and calm the situation. Now, the information we have so far is that the police have taken children off a Romani family. We don't know why, and without the facts, we shouldn't speculate. So, no, it's not a race riot. It's not Muslims attacking police officers like many people on social media are spreading. Helena, people have been smearing Mohsin Ali, who was doing his job, clearly because he's a Muslim. I mean, that's the reason behind it, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. This all started back when he was originally elected. There was a video that went viral of him specifically. I think he said Allahu Akbar specifically when he won his council election.
Yeah, you're right.
And this was spread around by people saying, oh, this man's a terrorist, etc., etc. When really and truly, it just means God is great. And it's an Abrahamic religion, so it's the same God as the Christian God, technically. So I don't know what they're trying to read into this, but of course, it's just a phrase that people from certain faiths will use when in those kind of situations, regardless. But it was used to smear him at the time. And of course, they're then digging this up. Max Headroom himself, Ollie London, coming back to talk about this as well. And again, we've all seen they have a specific narrative in their mind that they want to push. They didn't even have any evidence to hand, whatever. They just assumed. Nigel Farage described it as subcontinental behaviour, if you can imagine such a thing. When, of course, the people who were originally doing these problems were people from Europe. And there were, as was been reported in the viral media's coverage of this, the actual ethnic makeup of people who were there doing rioting and also that's trying to stop and cool down the riots were both entirely mixed on both sides in this particular issue. I mean, we literally saw Mohsin Ali trying to grab a whole pallet of a white person to try and stop them throwing it on the fire as well. And then groups of people from subcontinental backgrounds with buckets of water trying to put the fire out. And he said it himself. Mohsin Ali said it himself as well. This is your community. This is your community. It's his community. He's a councillor for this community. And it's important politically. The videos that were going viral were people actually calling him saying, this guy, he's the Green Party councillor for this area, right? He's a good man doing these things. There's a reason why. After Grenfell, when Jeremy Corbyn was the first person on the ground to tend to the scene, he was lauded. And when Theresa May took ages to come, she was vilified. When you actually take care of the communities that you belong to, people will recognise that for you politically. And that's very, very important for those. Again, Salma Arif was a Labour councillor, and she was also there as well. I would say, where are the Reform UK councillors? But there aren't any. So they couldn't have come down even if they wanted to. And one last point I would make is that this isn't new. This isn't new of people defending their communities in this way and going viral for it. We all remember in 2011, the lady who was on the streets shouting at people rioting back then in the Mark Duggan riots, telling people this is your community you're destroying. And it's the same thing. And they're both largely, as far as I'm concerned, downwind of the neglecting of certain communities due to lack of investment, due to austerity cuts, right? People can only get into these positions to feel like it's necessary to do these things if their material conditions have been deteriorated so much they feel like they have no other choice.
I'm glad you brought up the earlier video. I think it was before the general election. It was after, actually, it was the local elections, wasn't it? Of Mohsin Ali saying Allahu Akbar, and obviously people are losing their minds, and it literally means God is great. It's no different from a Christian saying I love God, whatever it is. And obviously the dog whistle there is, well, Muslims are dangerous. Now, some people, to move on from that, people criticise Mohsin Ali by saying, and you brought up that point of austerity and investment. He says the community needs investment. They were saying to him, hold on a second, residents in your community are acting violent, they're attacking the police, they're trashing the place, and you make a political point of investment. Obviously, I disagree with that. I think, places that are left behind does need that. But I want to ask you, do you think, obviously, what specifically happened here, we don't have the full facts, but what drives people to such extreme measures in this case? I mean, do you have a kind of analysis behind this, why these things happen? Even if it seemingly doesn't seem like it's connected to austerity, why do people take such extreme measures?
I mean, it's the thing that sets the stage for community discohesion to take hold so that something that does happen can snap and create these issues. So, for example, in this case, I believe, as you said, it was somebody having their children taken away by social services and then the authorities not properly interacting with them that led to the anger bubbling over. But the anger can't exist unless there's a material basis for it in the first place, right? there's a reason why there were basically no riots throughout from 1997 to 2010, when people's living standards were increasing broadly across the country. Yet when loads of communities across the country, in the Thatcher years and in the austerity years, there were riots all the time, loads of different riots across different communities. Again, as far as I'm concerned, as a basis of community discohesion created by a lack of not just, I think it's also really important to say it can't just be a singular lack of material access to better conditions, but it's also specifically around that's juxtaposed next to other communities that do have it. It's relative poverty and things like this that cause increases in crime, because that's the differential that matters. The difference between, especially when you looked at, for example, the riots in London, people living on poor council estates on one end of the road and £1 million mansions on the other. This is what creates the discohesion that can allow these kind of views to fester over time. And the problem is, of course, is that when you're a liberal, you're an idealist. You believe that it's individuals acting with poor thoughts in their head, the impure thoughts that's made them to do these things, and they're just bad individuals.
To pick up on the liberalism thing, which is quite funny because you wouldn't ever sort of merge the far right and liberalism if we're playing wordplay, but the analysis behind it is exactly the same. Liberals don't have a class understanding, so they'll just think, well, it's ideas that drive the world. And then the right wing or the far right either ignore the class analysis or they don't have one either. And they think it's simply culture. That is their politics, isn't it? Which is why, it's fair to say when you see people like Ollie London and Alex Phillips saying, it's to do with the failure of multiculturalism. But you've pointed out, and actually, I didn't even know this, but between the new Labour government, I didn't realise that the riots were fairly low. I mean, obviously, there were problems with that government, but material conditions for people did increase. But given that right-wing pundits are quick to say that multiculturalism's failed, it seems that people from different backgrounds and faiths came together to try and restore order in Hare Hill. So I understand what you're saying in terms of austerity, in terms of funding, that can break down community cohesion. But actually, in the face of what happened last night, we had people from all different backgrounds come together. That's a pretty good thing, right? And that's where right-wingers, that's what they get wrong.
Well, exactly. Like, the biggest line that you hear from these types is, for anti-multiculturalism, is this idea that we are importing an alien culture, is what they say. That's the line that they'll take, which is incompatible with our own culture. And as you can see from the multi-ethnic, kind of, I guess, coalition of people who came down to try and cool the scenes that we were seeing there. Of course, there were people on both sides who were from different ethnicities and from different cultures who were both in the right and the wrong in this situation. But it shows that this idea that culture is this immutable basis for a values set, and whether they can be incompatible or not, is completely blown apart by what we saw both now, and of course what we've seen back in 2011 as well. And what does it come back to? Of course, the really important thing here is material conditions. Which communities are in worse material conditions in this country? Broadly, as we've seen, it's ones with larger proportions of people from immigrant backgrounds, because they get left behind. They deliberately get left behind. They have fewer recourse to public funds. Some would say, of course, very justifiably. But unless you have proper investment broadly in communities, rather than having that stripped away, that's going to lead to unfortunate tensions arising. But as the right wing, especially like the conservative right wing, don't have a material basis for their analysis of what happens throughout society, they can only fall back on their understanding of culture.
We'll sort of jump in what I said before, that liberals don't have a class understanding, and the right either don't understand or they ignore it. I think that, I could be wrong here, and you're welcome to disagree, but I feel like the people on the right do grasp it better, but they choose to ignore it. For example, it might seem like this example's not relevant, but I think it is. When Nigel Farage says that he would scrap the 2-child benefit cap, right? I think you see movements in Europe, right? Some right-wing parties are starting to support more interventionist economic policies. So I do think that the right does grasp material dynamics and class politics, but obviously they don't care about the working class, so they push the culture wars on people, whereas liberals kind of don't understand it. Would you say I'm in the ballpark there? You think?
I think that's reasonable. I mean, we've seen far right movements essentially come out of left wing movements throughout, like the early kind of 30s. And look at Italy, for example, very specifically. Mussolini was somebody who came from a left wing background who then moved to the far right. They have an understanding of collectivism. Like, that's the one thing that the right and the left share, is they have a collectivist understanding of the world
Yeah.
rather than an individualist one. It's just the culture and ethnicity and national focus of the right is completely antithetical to the class-based analysis of the left. I think you're right in that. But of course, I think when I look at people like Nigel Farage supporting more interventionist policy, I think this is more out of a desire to appeal to broad consensus among what people want on economically, rather than some brand plan to fix people's material conditions, if you know what I mean.
Just Stop Oil activists have been handed a combined sentence of 21 years for, wait for it, planning a protest. The 5 activists were arrested after planning a protest via Zoom. The founder of JSO, Roger Hallam, was given 5 years. Activists Lucia, Cressy, Louise and Daniel have received 4-year prison sentences. Now, what law did they break? The JSO protesters were convicted of conspiracy to commit public nuisance under Section 78 of the controversial Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which was criticised as a wholesale attack on the right to protest. It carries a maximum 10-year sentence. So the maximum is 10 years. What does our legal system say about other crimes? Average sentence for violent crime equals 1.7 years. Average sentence for the JSO activists equals 4.3 years. Now, as you can see, robbery, drug and violent crime are on average given softer sentences. I'm sorry, but this is truly shocking. But let's take a little look into Christopher Eyre, the judge that handed those sentences to the activists. Deliberately crashing a car into the gates of Downing Street and possessing indecent images of children. A suspended sentence. On-duty police officer having sex in a patrol car with a vulnerable woman who he'd offered to drive home after she was ejected from a nightclub. Suspended sentence. Failures contributing to the spread of a fire in which 2 women died. A £40,000 fine. Charging refugees for legal work despite having been struck off. £2,858 fine. But participating in a Zoom call as part of a successful campaign to stop the UK government licensing new oil and gas, thereby saving many lives, 4 years in prison. But let's not forget this one. Paedophile that drugged school children and used them to masturbate gets 12-month suspended sentence. Helena, why are activists who are trying to save the planet given 5 years in prison for a Zoom call planning to protest, which is just about legal these days, but violent crimes, robbery, are given softer sentences on average?
I mean, this was a deliberate desire by the Conservative government, essentially to punish Just Stop Oil specifically. The way that they had worded and given the sentencing guidelines for this very specific crime, the conspiracy to commit public nuisance, which again, the public nuisance offence that they tried to do here was specifically related to things like blocking traffic. So they've essentially concocted this entire criminal offence to pick on one specific group, which is quite a new kind of precedent they've set in terms of the kind of legislation that they'll pass. And of course, the kind of legislation that Labour have said they're not going to be rolling back is quite draconian, incredibly authoritarian. But the sentencing guidelines, I believe, it's up to 10 years that you can get for up to 10 years. The sentencing guidelines for rape are 4 to 19 years. So that's a similar kind of length of sentence they're looking to be handing down here. And it's absolutely being done to try and stifle dissent, to try and crush peaceful protests. And what was crazy to me as well was seeing the reaction to this. People were so mad about it that they were just like, these people should be locked up for life. Some kind of comments that I'd seen from people, all trying to claim that somehow you getting to work an hour late is justification for huge, long prison sentences. Now, of course, that will preclude them from early exit with good behaviour or whatever. But even so, when you compare it to other crimes that have far more utilitarian bad associated with them, far worse utility associated with them, it absolutely makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever to be able to have an average sentence for conspiracy to commit public nuisance, quote unquote, be higher than violent crime or robbery, for example. Absolutely preposterous.
I mean, to play devil's advocate here, I mean, they're a public nuisance. They were arrested for conspiring to cause disruption. You know, ambulances can't get to hospitals. People can't get to work. This causes hardship for people. What would you say to that argument? Because let's be honest, a lot of people say that.
I mean, I've always said, I even said when I commented this earlier this week, I don't agree with Just Stop Oil's tactics. I think they put people off. I've been given some information since then that's made me kind of sway my opinion on this broadly. But it doesn't matter whether you like their tactics or not. Freedom to protest peacefully and non-violently should be the democratic right of all citizens within a liberal democracy. We have asked time and time again for the government to take climate change seriously. We even voted a government in 2019 who had promises to take climate change seriously within their manifesto that they then broke under a new leader that nobody voted for. So there's literally no reason at all that the government have. There's no justification or mandate at all for the government to stop taking climate change seriously, given their promises in their manifesto, at least the Conservative one beforehand. So if the government doesn't do what they say they're going to do, and they're not going to be another election for the next 3 years, you can't just unless you impress upon lawmakers, they have no reason to listen to you until the next election comes round. So the only other option people have is protest. You can say they need to be punished somehow because they were disruptive, and I'm open to those criticisms. But the idea that is worthy of 4-year prison sentences, 5 in the case of Roger Hallam, more than some people get for things like sexual assault and domestic abuse, ridiculous.
And what happened to the classic liberal idea of freedom? I mean, it seems like that. Look, I know this is these are Tory policies designed. I mean, I had an interaction on Twitter who said Keir Starmer's Britain, and like I've got no love lost for him, but these are designed by the Tories. The question is whether it's going to be changed, which, let's be honest, past statements from Keir Starmer doesn't sound like he's going to do much. I want to talk about him in a second. But the classic liberal idea of freedom, I mean, let's go back to, all the way back to, I think, JFK, who said, those who make peaceful protest harder, violent revolution is inevitable in a way. And we seem to have lost that, don't you think? I mean, yes, I know we expect the right-wing pundits to want to clamp down on this. They've always been authoritarian. But, I mean, I feel like I'm even seeing so-called centrists or so-called liberals who aren't speaking up enough about our freedom to protest.
Well, absolutely. The problem with conservatism, though, is they don't actually believe in liberty at all. That's always been a cope from their end. What they actually believe in is an in-group that the law should protect and not bind, and an out-group that the law should bind but not protect. That has been the central theme of conservative ideology since its inception, for generations and some centuries at this point. And of course, when they believe in liberty, they believe in it for themselves. They don't believe in it for people crossing the channel or people protesting things that have been abandoned by the state, or indeed for minorities that they don't like from having access to things that they don't want them to because they disagree with it. The liberty has only been something that they desire for themselves. And in the same things with regards to how they talk about free speech. They've actually never really cared about free speech in terms of like a blanket support of it. Where was their silence, for example, on things like free speech, quote unquote, when people were being carted away for holding up blank signs protesting the coronation of the king? They don't believe in liberty. They never have believed in liberty. It's always been an absolute cope. And really and truly, what they do believe is in personal freedom for themselves, and taking away the freedoms of outgroup that they perceive to not be in the national interest.
So I want to talk about Keir Starmer here, because when some of the protest laws were brought in, I think it might be the crime sentencing bill, and people asked Keir Starmer when he was leader of the opposition, or when he was in opposition at the time, they said, are you going to scrap these protest laws, anti-protest laws? And he said, well, we're going to let them bed in, right? I think we know Keir Starmer's authoritarian tendencies, right? However, at the same time, quite surprisingly, he has announced that thousands of people in prison are going to be released. I think a welcome move, because we're going to assume that these are non-violent criminals. We don't know. I don't know the specifics on it. But at the same time, I find it hard to believe that Keir Starmer is going to radically change our protest laws. That's a bit of a contradiction. What do you think? Do you think Starmer will actually change these laws? Do you think he's going to keep them in? Because let's be honest, his persona is quite authoritarian. Since he became Labour leader, or shortly afterwards, he seemed very strong against climate activists. Actually, he seemed more angry about climate activists than a bloody genocide, right? But again, I point to the fact that he has said that the government will release thousands of people from prison. So, and what do you think? I want to know, do you think he's going to change his policies on this, or and if he doesn't, where does this contradiction come from?
Well, I think the reason why, I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction, because of course the person who was put into the role that decided that we should be letting people out of prison early due to our prison overcrowding is a technocrat that they've appointed through the Lords, James Timpson, right? This isn't somebody who's a Labour Party politician. Yeah. This is somebody who they've been able to subcontract out decision-making to without a party political affiliation to it. So if people get mad about it, they can say, well, it's not our policy. We appointed an expert who's not affiliated to our party to decide what we should be doing through a position in the Lords, and they said this is what we should do, and we followed their expert advice, for example. This has been a way of trying to subcontract out things that the government should or shouldn't be doing to people to be able to absolve themselves of democratic accountability for ages, whether they agree with the legislation or not. In fact, it's a great way of being able to get what you want either way, because you can either acquiesce to it on technocratic grounds, or you can undermine it on democratic grounds, just like Tony Blair did with David Nutt and his recommendations for declassifications of things like drugs. They said, well, actually, no, we're not going to follow the advice. We don't need to, because people haven't voted for it yet. And so it never came to pass, even though it would have been correct for them to do so. Whereas when you look at, for example, how they want themselves to be perceived by the public, it's clear that they want to be perceived as more authoritarian on justice policy. It's clear that that's what they do want to see. And of course, that's where most of the population in this country lie. The broad kind of consensus on justice policy is they do like authoritarian justice policy. I don't. Most of my mates on the left don't. I don't think you do either, Curtis. But really and truly, this is something that the Labour Party have decided they have to acquiesce to try and win an election, because there's not going to be enough people who can appeal to on more kind of lenient grounds. When not only that, like Keir Starmer also has a history of being draconian. This is the same guy, of course, we all know about his meetings with Washington, the papers from them being destroyed about Julian Assange, and also somebody whose sentencing guidelines during the 2011 riots we were talking about before managed to get a Portuguese guy deported for stealing a scoop of ice cream. This isn't a guy who's necessarily always acted with the milk of human kindness in his heart, has he?
I mean, based on your answer, I'm convinced that you don't think he's going to change much in terms of protest laws. But actually, what does interest me quite a lot is that, like, yes, we've talked about Keir Starmer's record many a time, and you've just brought it up there again about how draconian he is. But at the same time, he's not a extremely right-wing politician, as in he's not a climate skeptic. He does believe that climate change is man-made. And I would have thought, even for a so-called centrist, I personally think centre-right, but let's just say centrist politician, that they at least are wax lyrical about taking climate change seriously. I mean, he's even got Ed Miliband, who, yes, all right, is to the left of Keir Starmer, attacking the Greens on their climate policy. So wouldn't Keir Starmer give up his authoritarian tendencies when it comes to an issue as important as climate change, right? I mean, if I was him, and I love my social conservatism, love to clamp down on crime and drugs, but I would be like, well, I would want to be lenient at least on climate protesters, because the climate change is the biggest issue that's facing humanity.
I think the problem is, of course, is that if you've run specifically on an electoral ticket of taking the climate change very seriously, like their big policy they ran on the election was this GB energy plan and decarbonisation by 2030 for clean power.
Yeah.
It undermines your political prospectus if people are out there protesting you, saying that you're not doing enough on climate change, right? That is really poor optics for you. So as much as they can have essentially embedded in law to try and prevent people from doing that for their own personal party political reasons, and of course to optically be seen to be authoritarian on justice policy, it's a win-win for Labour. It's a win-win for them to keep these protest laws in place, quite frankly.
I think that's an excellent point. But before we move on, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's watching, both on Twitter and on YouTube. Thank you to those who have been in the comments. Keep them coming in. If you like what we do, you can subscribe and share our content, share it with people, friends, family, even if you don't like them, just share it, because we want to get Turn Left out there. Now, we have multiple people working for Turn Left. However, it is all still voluntary. in order for us to dedicate more time to Turn Left, to upgrade the quality and to become a fully realised media organisation, you can support us financially on Patreon for £3 or £5 a month, or any one-off donation by going to patreon.com/turnleftmedia. Let's grow a socialist media alternative to take on the establishment commentariat. Be part of the journey, because we've only just begun. Now, on to our next story. The government has announced that they will resume UNRWA funding. The government has ended the funding pause on UNRWA, effective immediately. This begins with £21 million to support the humanitarian response in Gaza, provide essential services for refugees across the region, and alleviates the suffering of civilians. Now, UNRWA was defunded by many nations after some of its workers were accused of being involved in the October 7th attacks. But Palestinians desperately rely on support from UNRWA, and the mass defunding of the organisation was and is an abomination. It should have never happened, but it's clearly a positive step from the government to resume its funding. Helena, this is a welcome move, but it comes as a time where Labour have U-turned on their policy of removing the delay on the ICC's decision to issue an arrest warrant to Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, past statements from Keir Starmer himself has been in support of war crimes. Do you think the government has had a big shift in policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine compared to what they were saying in opposition? Or do you think this is a low-hanging fruit? You know, it's still not good enough and doesn't really change the fact that Labour are still very pro-Israel?
I mean, it's definitely a start. I understand now that they have a pro-Palestinian, or at least somebody who is anti the BDS bill as their Attorney General, although he's somebody who donated to Keir Starmer's leadership campaign, so who knows where his loyalties truly lie on this issue, but clearly he's somebody who has a lot more principles in terms of how we deal legally with Israel. And this is really more important now. Like, the refund is something that is clearly necessary to ensure that they keep to their pre-election promise specifically, which was ensuring maximum aid going into Palestine. Like, they have to commit to this essentially, because aid was the thing that they said was most necessary, because they don't want to oppose the war prima facie. They still are running with this line that the war itself is justified. It's just the way in which they're conducting the war is somehow not being done in the correct manner. Now, of course, neither of these things are true. It is clearly, I don't immediately personally a just war that they are having here, especially not in the way that they have conducted it, prima facie. There are other issues, of course, in terms of things that is going to be necessary for them to do with regards to how they deal with Israel moving forward. For example, in the ICJ ruling that came out with regards to the settlements in the West Bank, one of the rulings that was done in point 278, I think it was saying that states have, I think, a duty not to have economic dealings with people who are contributing to the expansions of settlements in the West Bank. Now, I don't know if people know this, but there are two oil fields that got approved by the Conservative government just recently, the ones I had lots of protests about, which is Campo and Rosebank. In both of those oil fields, one of the companies that's been given the license to drill in our territorial waters is Ithaca Energy. Now, that's based in Aberdeen, but it's 75% owned by Delek Group, which is an Israeli oil firm, and they have been internationally condemned for directly helping to finance settlements in the West Bank. This is something that is now essentially, that is a dealing which is in contravention of a ruling handed down by the ICJ. So there are loads of things now that are going to be really difficult for Labour to be able to have to prove that they can uphold the rights of international law, when, of course, there are loads of things even outside of this conflict. Israel has been behaving in an illegal manner, for, ever since 1967. And of course, our governments have condemned little actions here and there. They've shown tepid support to Palestinians, but they've never recognised the state. And of course, they've never properly condemned Israel in broad terms for its illegal occupation and annexation, which we now know to internationally be recognised as the case.
So, I mean, essentially what you're saying is this doesn't change the makeup, it doesn't change, not in a big way, right? So essentially we're kind of still on the Labour is still largely pro-Israel, but there are certain things that you feel like they have to do. And I guess resuming funding for UNRWA, I feel like Starmer has the political capital to do that in terms of his own sort of sphere. But going after specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, it's different. I think you have to be almost braver to do it, right? So I guess he can hide behind the sort of, it's the proper thing to do. But then again, there are other things. If the ICC does issue an arrest warrant and Labour essentially U-turned on that policy, it essentially puts Labour in a bind. And I'm finding their position on Israel very confusing now. I mean, I have no doubt that many people on the front bench are pro-Israel. A lot of them are Zionists. I think that's very, very clear. But I'm struggling to see what Keir Starmer's trying to map out here. Is he just almost throwing chicken feed? I mean, I don't want to say that restoring funding to UNRWA is just chicken feed. I mean, it makes a whole load of difference to Palestinians. But in the wider picture here, it feels like it's low hanging fruit. Okay, so I mean, yeah. So do you think that's essentially Labour are sticking where they are, or do you think as time goes on, we may be able to push them, get more concessions out them?
The issue, I think, is that I don't think we'll be able to push them because, of course, unfortunately, one thing that comes over this is the fact that our foreign policy is still dictated to us by Washington. It's still dictated to us by the American State Department in terms of how we are allowed to set our broad diplomatic agenda. Because, of course, there are plenty of things that we can do, which, as you say, you describe it as chicken feed, but in terms of like broad diplomatic policy, I agree, because plenty of countries throughout Europe are still giving money or resumed their funding to UNRWA as well. The issue, of course, is how we deal with things diplomatically. And, of course, if we did things like advocate for sanctions on Israeli leaders that they absolutely deserve, that's never going to happen. Of course, David Handoff shaking hands with Netanyahu earlier this week, sorry. So there really is, this kind of diplomatic barrier to what they can and can't do because of their desire, essentially, to appease who sets our policy, who sets our numbers, which is essentially just Washington, D.C., and, of course, to not break apart their diplomatic links with Israel, which are more important to them, the short-term political gain, which they definitely will get by acquiescing to the broad public consensus for support for the Palestinian cause, support for a Palestinian state, and opposition to specifically the war in Gaza that's happening right now, even if it's not necessarily broad opposition to the state of Israel, broad in terms of how it treats the Palestinians across the board.
Now, we're going to move on to our final story of the evening, but it's still on Israel. The ICJ has ruled that Israel engages in systematic oppression of Palestinians and that the occupation is illegal. The ICJ said that Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territories are illegal under international law. Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law, President Nawaf Salam said, reading the findings of a 15-judge panel. Now, the panel also said that Israel is engaging in racial segregation and apartheid.
A number of participants have argued that Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory amount to segregation or apartheid in breach of Article 3 of CERD. Article 3 of CERD provides as follows, I quote, "States parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction."
Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has responded to the verdict, and his response was, and I quote, Netanyahu lashes out at ICJ lies, says the Jewish people do not occupy their own land. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable thing to say. When Palestine has been occupied by Israel, the land belonged to the Palestinians. But it doesn't end there. Israel's foreign ministry has rejected the ICJ's advisory opinion, describing it as politically biased and completely detached from reality. The statement criticized the ruling for ignoring the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. The ministry also noted that the opinion contradicts the principle that peace can only be achieved through direct negotiations, accusing the Palestinian Authority of attempting to undermine Israel through international tribunals. Furthermore, Israel emphasized that the blatant one-sided opinion is advisory and not legally binding, reiterating its commitment to the rule of law and international law. It's a funny way of twisting it. Now, yes, it is worth noting that this isn't legally binding. I mean, Helena, what do you make of this this verdict? I mean, as I said, it's not legally binding, but do you think this is significant in any way? Do you think this will change things?
In terms of how we deal with Israel economically, I was going back to what I was saying previously. There are so many economic dealings that we'll have that are going to have to be scrutinised based on how people are actually interacting with people who could be perceived or can have links to influencing or funding increasing settlements in the West Bank. That's something that Western governments are going to have to contend with now that they have a ruling down from the ICJ. I guess if it's not necessarily binding, at the very least it puts pressure on the internal democracies of these countries, when there is now clear evidence coming from the highest court in the world that these things are indeed the apartheid that they've obviously been called this by Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, all of these people like that, and Amnesty International have described it as such for many, many years now. What I find very funny, though, was in Israel's response to this was like, well, this judgment clearly doesn't recognise the atrocities that Hamas committed on October the 7th. I'm like, mate, this isn't about October 7th. Again, get too busy, essentially, for all Western audiences trying to obfuscate any criticism of their historic policy by trying to claim that, well, the only reason why we're in this position is because of October 7th. I'm like, no, the reason we're in this position is because of 50 years of occupation. 1967, you illegally annexed these territories. And of course, one of the big rulings in this judgment is that, temporary occupations in legitimate military campaigns can be justified, but long-scale occupations that essentially are de facto annexation are wrong. And that was the judgment that was made here. This goes way before October the 7th. You can't just hand-wave away all criticism of apartheid today by going, what about October the 7th? There's complete, utter nonsense that we're seeing here. But of course, this does impugn the fact that we have supported this government. Western powers have supported Israel's apartheid regime for decades and decades without any kind of scant criticism. So when dealings in Lebanon in the 80s and in the 2000s, that there was ever any pushback from Western nations since 1967, really and truly, in terms of Reagan essentially calling down the assault on Lebanon and Thatcher getting rid of arms sales in the 80s, and of course Blair essentially having to step down over conflicts due to the Israel's 2006 war in Lebanon too. So they've been able to go away scot-free. But now that we have rulings, we can put more democratic pressure on our own governments to acquiesce to a far more humanitarian foreign policy without continual accusations of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel.
The ICJ have also mentioned October 7th. Okay, everyone condemns it, and I think it's another way of trying to just shift the narrative on this, shift the spotlight. But I think it's maximum gaslighting when you got the Israel ministry saying, well, this isn't legally binding and we care about international law. So because it's not legally binding, they're not upholding international law. I'm like, fuck, that is gaslighting to the maximum. What do you think the response from our government will be? I mean, earlier we spoke about Labour, delaying. They're still going to delay the ICC arrest warrant to Netanyahu. We spoke about how Labour have tied themselves into a knot. But Starmer wants to be a man who cares about international law. His government is happy to restore UNRWA funding. But will he go as far as to correctly point out that Israel is committing war crimes?
I don't think they will. No, again, it'd be too far away from the American State Department's line on this. I mean, maybe that'll change coming in the future, really and truly, but there are too many connections to people who have a material interest in protecting the state of Israel within the Labour Party at the moment for them to go that far. I think we'll only get away, as far as they're concerned, with what they need to do to win back democratic popular support, rather than what is good or what is right, or is indeed what was in international way. Otherwise, why would they be continuing with this opposition to the ICC arrest warrants? Why would they still not have called off arms sales to Israel when we already know from the Alicia Kearns leaks that the government have been given recommendations that they should? Or the previous government were given recommendations that they should, let alone this one. So there are plenty of things that they could have done. They could have promised, they could have intimated they were going to do before now that were clear as day without this ruling. And the fact that this has come, I don't think that will necessarily push when we all know that our foreign policy decisions are made elsewhere.
But it's very interesting to see what the government response is. But it is obviously down to Washington. I mean, let's be honest, we seem to follow the US foreign policy. And I guess it also hinges on the election in the US. I would like to ask you about, look, let's say Donald Trump becomes president, right? And essentially he has to keep that special relationship with the US. But at the same time, you've got Donald Trump, who is, I would say, more pro-Israel than Biden. He's going to do things and say things that are even more extreme than Biden, I think. So what do you think Keir Starmer, someone who wants to be the central, the adult in the room, how do you think he's going to handle a Donald Trump presidency, again, who I think is more pro-Israel than Biden?
I mean, we've seen in the statements that have been made by cabinet ministers already about the common ground to find with JD Vance and how they would essentially kind of disassociate themselves with previously very antagonistic comments that they've made about Donald Trump when they were in opposition. I think they'll absolutely acquiesce to the things that Donald Trump wants when he's in power. I don't think they'll provide particularly strong opposition. Otherwise, why would they be deliberately making very clear and open public statements, essentially to the tune of, well, we'll try and find whatever we need to work with Donald Trump. We should work with Marine Le Pen on the small boats issue, right? This isn't somebody that we can just always take the most progressive line. Well, the progressive reason is wanting the world as it's at, which essentially just means that we'll go with the American State Department line, whether or not there's somebody progressive in the presidency or not.
All very, very true. I just want to say to thank you to everyone who has put up with our tech issues tonight. That's what happens when you're on the left-wing video and audio. But that is all for tonight. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. And once again, of course, I'd like to thank Helena for her amazing insights. Now, make sure you subscribe to her channel. I'm sure a lot of you already have. You can follow her on all the socials. And also, she's on Twitch. The link is in the description. You can also support Turn Left by subscribing to us and sharing our content widely. Get our name out there. And if you like our work, you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation. Help us become full-time. Go to patreon.com/turnleftmedia. We will be back this Sunday for Normal Islands The Debrief, a 3-way panel show going over the political stories of the week gone by. That is Sunday, 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. My name's Curtis Daly. Thank you and see you next time. I'm excited to say that Turn Left has significantly grown this year. And with that, we've managed to produce far more ambitious content, interviewing high-profile people. We did a 12-hour live election show. There are multiple people behind Turn Left, but we are still working around our full-time work. But we would love it if this was our full-time. It means we could dedicate so much more and to bring even more ambitious content. So if you've been here from the beginning, or you've only recently become a viewer, if you like what we do, then you can help us out. Please like and share this video. Make sure you drop a comment. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your feedback, and we desperately need more independent media. If you want to see a socialist media alternative thrive, then you could be part of that. So if you can, you could support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation. We can use that money to upgrade our equipment, to rent out a proper studio, and to start paying ourselves. This is only the beginning. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.